the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk emerged during a transitional moment in aviation history, when piston engine fighters were evolving rapidly in the late 1930s and military planners worldwide were preparing for conflicts of unprecedented scale. The United States Army Air Corps, recognizing that its pursuit aircraft were falling behind foreign designs, pushed American manufacturers to deliver faster, stronger, and more heavily armed fighters. At the forefront was the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, already well known for its P-36 Hawk. The P-36 had been adequate for its time, but by 1937-1938 it was clear that aircraft with retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpits, and more powerful engines were now the standard. The United States lagged behind European developments, particularly those of Germany and Britain, where fighters like the Bf-109 and Spitfire set new benchmarks for speed and agility. Curtiss responded by experimenting with adapting the P-36 airframe to accommodate the Allison V1710 inline engine. This power plant promised streamlined aerodynamics and greater performance compared to radial engines. By combining the proven structure of the P-36 with the more modern engine, Curtiss sought to deliver a capable fighter quickly without the risks of an entirely new design. The resulting concept became the P-40. While not revolutionary in blueprint, it was a pragmatic solution. An airframe with known handling qualities paired with a liquid-cooled inline engine. This allowed engineers to accelerate development and provide the Army Air Corps with a new fighter before more advanced designs, such as the P-38 Lightning, were ready for mass production. The P-40 embodied compromise, neither the fastest nor the most advanced, but it was rugged, adaptable, and most importantly, available in numbers when war broke out. Development was not without hurdles. The Allison engine lacked a turbo supercharger, limiting high-altitude performance compared to European contemporaries. American industry had not yet mastered high-output engines with reliable supercharging systems, which meant that while the P-40 could perform adequately at low to medium altitudes, it was at a disadvantage above 15,000 feet. Nonetheless, its designers focused on strengths, durability, strong diving speed, and heavy armament. These qualities would later prove decisive in the hands of skilled pilots, particularly in theaters where altitude was less critical. In 1938, the prototype XP-40 took flight, essentially a P-36 fitted with the V1710 engine. The prototype impressed military officials with its speed, well above the P-36, and handling, although shortcomings in climb rate and ceiling were immediately apparent. Extensive modifications followed, including refinements to the cooling system, fuselage streamlining, and armament configuration. Each adjustment sought to balance performance with reliability, ensuring the aircraft could be produced and maintained in large numbers. The urgency of looming conflict accelerated acceptance. In April 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps ordered 524 P-40s, the largest American fighter order to that date. This decision was driven less by the aircraft's perfection than by necessity. The United States needed modern fighters quickly, and the P-40 was available. The order secured Curtiss a prominent role in American aviation and set the stage for the Warhawk's widespread service. As production began, the P-40 entered a world already sliding toward war. By 1940, Europe was aflame, and American aircraft were being evaluated by foreign customers eager to supplement their forces. Britain and France both placed orders, while China sought American fighters to counter Japanese advances. This international demand would soon thrust the P-40 into the spotlight, with its most famous chapters written not by American squadrons at first, but by Allied pilots and volunteers flying under foreign flags. Thus, the origins of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk reveal a story of adaptation and pragmatism. Born from an older design but improved with new technology, it was not the perfect fighter its creators may have envisioned, but it was the right fighter at the right time. In the years ahead, it would prove itself in battlefields ranging from North Africa to the Pacific, earning a reputation as a dependable workhorse, and as the mount of the legendary Flying Tigers, whose shark-mouthed P-40s became one of the most iconic images of the Second World War. The prototype and testing phase of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was marked by a combination of ingenuity, compromises, and relentless adjustment to make the fighter combat-ready. The first prototype, designated XP-40, was essentially a Curtiss P-36 Hawk airframe, re-engineered to house the Allison V1710 liquid-cooled inline engine. The decision to adapt an existing design instead of starting from scratch reflected both the urgency of the moment and the limited capacity of the U.S. aviation industry in the late 1930s. On 14 October 1938, the P-40 made its maiden flight at Buffalo, New York, and instantly showed potential by achieving a maximum speed of nearly 340 miles per hour, significantly faster than the P-36. Yet the flight trials quickly revealed flaws that could not be ignored. The Allison engine's single-stage supercharger restricted high-altitude performance. Above 15,000 feet, climb rate and overall power dropped noticeably, making the aircraft less competitive against European fighters designed for operations at altitude. American engineers recognized the limitation but accepted it for practical reasons. The United States lacked a mature turbo-supercharging system that could be readily integrated. Instead, focus shifted to optimizing the P-40's performance in low and medium altitude environments, where it would later find success. Testing at Wright Field produced a constant stream of modifications. Engineers refined the radiator placement, adjusting it under the nose to improve airflow and reduce drag. Armament layouts were also altered repeatedly. Early configurations mounted two synchronized 50-caliber machine guns in the nose, but additional wing-mounted guns were added in later models to provide heavier firepower. Cockpit design was updated with a more streamlined canopy and improved instrumentation to enhance pilot visibility and navigation. Each change, though small, reflected the Army Air Corps' demand for a fighter that could be quickly standardized for mass production without losing essential combat effectiveness. By 1939, the P-40 had been sent through competitive trials against other contemporary designs. While it did not outperform experimental types like the Lockheed XP-38, it was considered the most practical for immediate deployment. Its performance at lower altitudes, combined with its robust construction and good diving speed, convinced military evaluators that it could serve as a stopgap until more advanced fighters were ready. This pragmatism led to the landmark order of 524 aircraft in April 1939, a clear signal that the United States was willing to back the P-40 as its principal fighter despite its limitations. Foreign interest provided further incentive to refine the design. The French government, anticipating the need to reinforce its air arm, placed significant orders for the P-40 in 1940. After France's collapse, these contracts were transferred to Britain, which adopted the aircraft under the name Tomahawk. British test pilots echoed American concerns about its altitude performance, but praised its ruggedness, ease of handling, and heavy armament compared to earlier U.S. fighters. These evaluations prompted additional refinements, such as reinforcing the fuel tanks and adding armor protection for the pilot, features demanded by the Royal Air Force after bitter experiences in the Battle of Britain. Production variants began to emerge in quick succession. The P-40B and P-40C introduced self-sealing fuel tanks and improved armament, while the P-40D featured a redesigned nose to accommodate a more powerful version of the Allison engine. Each new variant reflected lessons learned in trials and the urgent feedback from combat theaters where early models had already begun to appear. Although none of the changes solved the fundamental altitude issue, they gradually improved survivability and firepower, making the Warhawk a tougher and more reliable aircraft in real combat conditions. By the time production was in full swing in late 1940, the P-40 had become a symbol of American rearmament. Its testing phase had not produced a perfect fighter, but it had created one that could be built in quantity, exported to allies, and adapted to evolving battlefield requirements. The transition from prototype to production was therefore less about achieving peak performance and more about establishing a solid, dependable baseline fighter for the critical years ahead. This approach would prove decisive once the United States entered the Second World War, when numbers, durability, and adaptability often mattered more than cutting-edge performance. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk entered service at a time when the global balance of air power was in flux, and its early operational role reflected both the aircraft's strengths and its inherent compromises. The first deliveries to the United States Army Air Corps began in 1940, equipping pursuit groups that had previously been flying obsolescent aircraft such as the P-26 and P-36. For American pilots, the Warhawk represented a significant leap forward. Its all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and powerful armament placed it in an entirely new category compared to the biplanes and transitional monoplanes that had only recently left service. Initial squadron integration revealed mixed reactions. Pilots praised the aircraft's ruggedness and ability to absorb punishment, as well as its excellent performance in high-speed dives. The P-40 could outdive most contemporary fighters, a quality that would later prove decisive in combat. However, its sluggish climb rate and poor high-altitude performance were quickly noted, leading to the development of tactics that emphasized strengths at lower altitudes while avoiding prolonged dogfights above 15,000 feet. This tactical doctrine, hit fast, dive away, and use superior durability, would become characteristic of Warhawk units throughout the war. The first combat trials of the P-40 came not in American service, but through foreign operators. Britain, having inherited French orders after 1940, deployed the aircraft as the Tomahawk in North Africa. Early combat experience there confirmed both the aircraft's limitations and its potential. Against the Messerschmitt Bf-109E, the Tomahawk struggled in climb and altitude, but at low level it proved formidable. Its armament of multiple 50-caliber machine guns and its sturdy frame made it effective in ground attack missions as well as in air-to-air engagements conducted with proper tactics. RAF pilots, adjusting to the aircraft's characteristics, developed methods that exploited its strengths while minimizing exposure to its weaknesses. Perhaps the most famous early operational role of the P-40 came with the American Volunteer Group, AVG, in China, better known as the Flying Tigers. Before the United States officially entered the war, Curtiss P-40Bs and Cs were shipped to China to help defend supply routes and key bases against Japanese attacks. Under the leadership of Claire Chennault, the AVG trained its pilots to use boom and zoom tactics, diving on enemy aircraft, firing in a quick pass, and then climbing away before the lighter, more maneuverable Japanese fighters could react. This approach played directly to the P-40's strengths in speed, firepower, and resilience. In the skies over Burma and China, the shark-mouthed P-40s of the Flying Tigers achieved an impressive kill ratio, cementing the Warhawk's reputation and providing one of the most iconic images of the air war in Asia. Meanwhile, in American service, the Warhawk began to see combat after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Although caught by surprise, P-40 units based in Hawaii and the Philippines mounted spirited defenses. In the Philippines, a handful of P-40s managed to get airborne during the initial strikes, scoring some of the first American aerial victories of the war. In the defense of Darwin, Australia in 1942, P-40 squadrons also played a critical role in blunting Japanese air raids, further demonstrating the aircraft's durability under fire. The Warhawk's operational use expanded rapidly as the United States mobilized. In the Pacific, it became one of the primary fighters during the critical early months, before more advanced aircraft like the P-38, P-47, and P-51 arrived in significant numbers. Its ability to operate from rough airfields, endure harsh conditions, and deliver both air defense and ground attack capabilities made it invaluable in the early stages of the campaign. At this stage, the P-40's reputation was shaped by necessity as much as by performance. It was not the fastest or most maneuverable fighter in the sky, but it was available in numbers and could be relied upon to fight and return. Pilots who mastered its handling and adopted suitable tactics found it to be a capable and often deadly opponent. As one of the first truly modern American fighters to see combat in large numbers, the Warhawk played a pivotal role in buying time for the United States and its allies until newer designs could take the lead. Thus, the early operational history of the P-40 established the pattern that would follow throughout the war. An aircraft that, while never the pinnacle of fighter technology, provided essential service across multiple theaters, carrying the burden of frontline defense and earning a reputation as a tough, dependable workhorse. The combat career of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk stretched across nearly every major theater of the Second World War, and its adaptability allowed it to serve in diverse roles that far exceeded initial expectations. In North Africa, the Warhawk, known to the British as the Tomahawk and later Kitty Hawk, formed the backbone of the Desert Air Force in 1941-1942. Against the Messerschmitt Bf-109F and Italian Machi C-202, the aircraft often found itself outclassed in altitude performance and maneuverability. However, Allied pilots adapted their tactics to maximize the P-40's rugged qualities. They used boom and zoom attacks, diving from altitude, delivering powerful bursts of fire from 6 .50 caliber machine guns, and escaping before opponents could respond. In this role, the Warhawk achieved respect, not as a duelist, but as a fast-hitting, hard-hitting fighter that could survive in harsh desert conditions where maintenance was difficult and dust constantly threatened engines. Ground attack became another critical mission. The P-40's strong construction allowed it to withstand damage from anti-aircraft fire while strafing enemy convoys, tanks, and infantry positions. Fitted with bombs or underwing racks for external stores, it became a versatile fighter bomber capable of disrupting Axis supply lines across North Africa. In these roles, its lower speed compared to the Spitfire or Mustang mattered less, while its toughness and firepower mattered more. Veterans of the Desert Air Force credited the P-40 with playing a major part in wearing down Rommel's Africa Corps by constantly attacking rear areas and armored columns. In the Pacific, the Warhawk proved equally indispensable. It became the workhorse fighter in Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands during the difficult early years of 1942-1943, facing Japanese aircraft such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 and Nakajima Ki-43. The P-40 was at a disadvantage in terms of maneuverability and turning ability, but it held key advantages: speed in a dive, firepower, and resilience. Allied pilots in the Pacific quickly learned to avoid turning contests with Japanese fighters and instead used slashing attacks. When disciplined tactics were applied, the Warhawk could meet the Zero on favorable terms, and its ability to withstand damage meant that many pilots survived encounters that would have destroyed lighter Allied fighters. China and Burma provided perhaps the most famous combat stage for the P-40. The American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, had already demonstrated its effectiveness before U.S. entry into the war. And after the AVG was absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1942, the aircraft continued to defend Chinese airspace. The shark-mouthed nose paint became synonymous with the Warhawk, symbolizing its aggressive role in the theater. Flying in difficult conditions, often from rough airstrips with limited supplies, the aircraft carried the burden of air defense and ground attack duties, helping to keep Japanese forces under pressure. The Soviet Union also became a major operator of the P-40 through Lend-Lease. Though not as highly regarded as the Yakovlev or Lavochkin fighters, the Warhawk filled an important niche as a durable, well-armed aircraft suitable for ground support. Soviet pilots often used it for escorting bombers and low to medium altitude fighting on the Eastern Front, where its limitations at high altitude were less critical. While some Soviet flyers considered it inferior to their home-built fighters, others appreciated its robust frame, reliable armament, and relative ease of maintenance under field conditions. Combat records show that the P-40 was not a superior fighter by technical standards, but it was often good enough in the right tactical context. In North Africa, it earned victories by providing constant pressure against Axis ground forces. In the Pacific and China, it delivered results by enforcing disciplined tactics against agile but lightly built Japanese aircraft. On the Eastern Front, it filled gaps in Soviet air power at a time when numbers mattered as much as advanced design. In every theater, the aircraft's adaptability, firepower, and toughness allowed it to achieve far more than its modest specifications might have suggested. By 1943 and 1944, newer fighters such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt began to take over frontline roles, and the Warhawk was increasingly relegated to secondary duties. Yet it continued to fly combat missions until the end of the war, particularly in ground attack and close support roles where its durability remained an asset. Pilots across the world often acknowledged that while it lacked the glamour of other fighters, it was a dependable and trustworthy machine, capable of delivering results under conditions where other aircraft might falter. The Warhawk's combat use thus illustrates the principle that in wartime, availability, durability, and tactical adaptation can be as decisive as cutting-edge performance. It never dominated the skies in the way that later fighters did, but it gave Allied forces a reliable, effective tool in critical years when no other option was available in such numbers. For many airmen, it was the aircraft that carried them through the hardest days of the war and gave them a fighting chance to survive. As the war expanded and the P-40 matured in service, numerous variants were developed to address both operational shortcomings and the diverse needs of Allied air forces. Each new version sought to refine performance, improve survivability, or adapt the aircraft to specialized roles. While none of these variants transformed the P-40 into a top-tier fighter, the steady evolution ensured that it remained viable across multiple theaters until war's end. The early production models, designated P-40B and P-40C in U.S. service, and Tomahawk 2A IIB in the Royal Air Force, featured improvements such as self-sealing fuel tanks and additional armor for the pilot, reflecting hard-learned lessons from early combat. Their armament of 2 nose-mounted 50-caliber machine guns and 4 wing-mounted 30-caliber guns gave them formidable firepower for the era, though British pilots criticized the lighter wing guns and pressed for standardization on heavier calibers. The P-40C further added provisions for external fuel tanks, extending operational range, an essential feature for long flights over oceanic or desert expanses. The most numerous early model was the P-40E, known to the RAF as the Kitty Hawk Y. This version replaced the wing-mounted 30-caliber weapons with 4 50-caliber guns, bringing total firepower to 6 heavy machine guns. The P-40E also introduced refinements in the fuselage design, strengthening of the structure, and modifications to improve cockpit protection. These changes made the aircraft better suited to both air combat and ground attack missions, particularly in North Africa, where its ability to carry bombs or external stores was increasingly exploited. Later versions, including the P-40K, P-40M, and P-40N, focused on incremental improvements in performance. The P-40K introduced a more powerful Allison V1710 engine, giving slightly better speed and climb, while also featuring modifications to the tail to improve stability at high speeds. The P-40M incorporated minor aerodynamic refinements and was supplied in large numbers to Allied nations, particularly New Zealand and the Soviet Union. The P-40N, sometimes referred to as the Warhawk's lightweight version, was the most produced variant of all, with over 5,000 built. It sought to reduce overall weight by removing some armor and equipment, which restored agility and climb performance lost in earlier, heavier models. The P-40N could reach higher speeds than most of its predecessors and remained in frontline service through 1944-1945. Sub-variants of the P-40N also reintroduced heavier armament and improved pilot visibility with a cut-down rear fuselage and bubble canopy, aligning with design trends seen in late war fighters. International users played a key role in shaping the Warhawk's variants. The British Commonwealth operated Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific, often requesting modifications to suit their specific combat environments. The Soviet Union received over 2,000 P-40s via Lend-Lease, most of them P-40E and later variants, and adapted them for frontline duties where low and medium altitude performance was more critical. Australia and New Zealand flew Kitty Hawks extensively in the Pacific campaigns, where they served as the mainstay of their fighter forces until late in the war. China, both under the American Volunteer Group and later regular Chinese air units, also relied heavily on the P-40, making use of its durability in difficult operating conditions. Specialized adaptations further expanded the Warhawk's utility. Some P-40s were converted into fighter bombers, carrying up to 1,000 pounds of bombs or external fuel tanks. Others were configured for reconnaissance, fitted with cameras to support ground operations. Training variants allowed new pilots to transition into combat units more effectively, while experimental versions explored different engine installations, including attempts to fit British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for improved altitude performance. Although the Merlin-powered P-40F and P-40L offered better high-altitude capabilities, they were produced in relatively small numbers compared to Allison-powered models. By the end of its production run, more than 13,000 P-40s of all variants had been built, making it the third most produced American fighter of the war, after the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt. While technological advances eventually overshadowed it, the steady refinement of its variants ensured that the Warhawk remained combat-capable from 1940 through 1945. In its multiple guises, Tomahawk, Kitty Hawk, and Warhawk, it adapted to the needs of Allied forces worldwide, proving itself not as a perfect aircraft but as a versatile and dependable machine that could be tailored to the shifting demands of global conflict. The global impact and legacy of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk cannot be measured solely by its technical specifications or combat kill ratios. Instead, its importance lies in the fact that it was available in numbers at a crucial point in history and could be adapted to the diverse needs of Allied forces across multiple continents. In the early years of the Second World War, when the United States and its allies were under immense pressure, the P-40 filled the gap until more advanced designs entered service. Its ruggedness, adaptability, and sheer ubiquity made it one of the key fighters of the conflict's formative years. The export history of the P-40 was remarkable. Britain, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and even smaller Allied nations operated the Warhawk or its Tomahawk and Kitty Hawk variants. For the British Commonwealth Air Forces, the Kitty Hawk became central in the Middle East and Pacific theaters. In the deserts of North Africa, it replaced older Hurricanes in frontline squadrons and proved more durable under punishing sand and heat conditions. In the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand relied heavily on Kitty Hawks for both air defense and offensive ground attack operations, using them to blunt Japanese advances when few other fighters were available. In the Soviet Union, the Warhawk played a different role. Although not as beloved as native Yakovlev or Lavochkin designs, it supplemented Soviet production and was employed extensively in bomber escort and ground attack missions. Soviet pilots appreciated its heavy firepower and resilience, even if they criticized its performance at higher altitudes. For China, the aircraft became iconic through the exploits of the American Volunteer Group and subsequent Chinese air units. The shark-mouthed P-40s flying against Japanese bombers and fighters not only defended vital supply routes, but also became enduring symbols of resistance and international cooperation. The Warhawk's influence extended into tactical doctrine. It demonstrated that fighters did not need to dominate every metric of performance to be effective. With the right tactics, using speed in a dive, exploiting firepower, and leveraging durability, pilots could counter technically superior opponents. This lesson influenced not only Allied air strategy, but also the training of pilots, who were taught to fight to the strengths of their aircraft rather than attempt to emulate enemies. In this respect, the P-40 was a teacher as much as a fighter, instilling discipline in its squadrons and laying the groundwork for future tactical doctrine. Although the P-40 was gradually replaced on the front lines by advanced fighters like the P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang, it continued to see combat service through 1945. Its final roles often involved close air support, where its ability to deliver bombs and strafe ground targets proved invaluable. In these missions, it carried forward the tradition of the rugged ground attack aircraft, bridging the gap between fighters and dedicated attack planes. Even as late as the invasion of Italy and the Pacific Island campaigns of 1944, P-40 squadrons played active roles in supporting ground troops and securing air superiority at the tactical level. After the war, the P-40's widespread distribution ensured its presence in many air forces for years. Nations such as Brazil, Turkey, and even some in South America and the Middle East retained Warhawks into the late 1940s. While it was quickly eclipsed by jet technology, it served as a reliable post-war platform for countries that could not immediately transition to newer designs. The aircraft's affordability, availability of spare parts, and proven combat record gave it an extended life beyond the main combat theaters. Culturally, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk became immortalized through its association with the Flying Tigers. The shark-mouthed nose art, painted originally by AVG pilots inspired by British designs, became one of the most recognizable images of the war. It appeared in propaganda posters, films, and later in countless books and documentaries. The sight of a P-40 diving with its menacing painted jaws wide open became a lasting symbol of determination and defiance. Today, only a limited number of P-40s survive, preserved in museums or kept flying by dedicated enthusiasts. Their presence at air shows serves as a reminder of the aircraft's vital role in holding the line during the war's most uncertain years. For aviation historians, the Warhawk's legacy lies not in technical supremacy, but in practicality. It was the fighter that was ready when it was needed most. It gave Allied pilots a capable mount during desperate times, contributed across continents, and left an indelible mark as one of the most widely used fighters of the Second World War. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk thus endures as a symbol of resilience and adaptability. It may never have been the best, but but it was never absent when needed. In the great tapestry of the air war, it was the aircraft that carried the burden of the early fight, proved itself in the hands of countless pilots from many nations, and helped secure the foundation upon which ultimate Allied air superiority was built. Among the less publicized chapters of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk's history are missions, projects, and uses that rarely appear in mainstream accounts but reveal the breadth of its service. Beyond its well-known role as a frontline fighter and fighter-bomber, the P-40 was employed in experimental programs, secondary tasks, and specialized operations that extended its influence beyond conventional air combat. One such avenue was its employment as a test platform. Because of its solid airframe and wide production base, engineers frequently selected the P-40 to trial new technologies. Several Warhawks were fitted with experimental armament configurations, including underwing cannons and rocket rails, in order to evaluate new forms of ground attack capability. These trials influenced later U.S. fighter designs that made heavy use of rockets and bombs for close support roles. Some aircraft were also modified to carry drop tanks of different shapes and capacities, testing the limits of extended range missions. The lessons learned from these experiments contributed to refining long-range escort tactics later applied with the P-51 Mustang. Another lesser-known role was reconnaissance. Several P-40s were adapted into photo reconnaissance variants fitted with cameras in place of weapons or auxiliary fuel. Although not as common as purpose-built reconnaissance aircraft, these modified Warhawks provided valuable intelligence in theaters where specialized aircraft were unavailable. Flying at medium altitudes and relying on their ruggedness, they documented enemy movements and terrain features critical for planning offensives in North Africa and the Pacific. Training roles also extended the Warhawk's service life. As more advanced fighters entered frontline duty, older P-40s were transferred to training schools. Here, they served to introduce new pilots to high-performance fighters, teaching them to handle higher speeds, more complex systems, and the rigors of gunnery practice. Its stability and forgiving handling characteristics made it suitable for advanced instruction, ensuring that new airmen could transition more easily to frontline machines like the P-47 or P-51. Several experimental projects explored the use of alternative power plants in the P-40 airframe. Most notable were the P-40F and P-40L variants, powered by Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. These versions attempted to address the altitude limitations of the standard Allison-powered models by taking advantage of the Merlin's superior high-altitude performance. Though produced in smaller numbers, they demonstrated the feasibility of such adaptations and provided valuable experience that influenced U.S. engine development programs. The Warhawk also figured in political and logistical missions that rarely received attention. In some cases, P-40s were ferried over long distances, including transoceanic flights, as part of Lend-Lease deliveries. These missions demanded extraordinary endurance and showcased the aircraft's reliability under sustained stress. Some Warhawks even served with air forces of smaller nations after the war, where they performed tasks ranging from border patrol to counterinsurgency operations, extending their operational relevance well into the late 1940s. Forgotten missions include its use in supporting partisan and resistance groups. In certain regions, particularly in China and the Balkans, P-40s carried out supply drops or ground attack sorties in support of irregular forces. These missions were seldom highlighted in official reports, yet they exemplified the Warhawk's flexibility and its ability to deliver practical results outside of conventional air campaigns. Veteran reflections provide further insight into these overlooked aspects. Many pilots recalled the Warhawk as an aircraft that demanded discipline but rewarded skill. Its limitations forced aviators to think tactically, to strike hard and retreat quickly, to avoid turning fights with more agile enemies, and to trust in its sturdy construction to bring them home. For some, the aircraft's reputation as a workhorse rather than a thoroughbred was a badge of honor, underscoring the idea that it did what was asked without pretension. In the broader picture, these unseen and secondary roles illustrate how the P-40 was more than just a frontline fighter of the early war. It was a versatile tool of experimentation, training, reconnaissance, and irregular warfare, contributing in ways that often went unnoticed but were essential in the wider Allied effort. These hidden chapters round out the story of the Warhawk, showing it not only as the flying tiger of the Pacific or the fighter of desert skies, but also as a quiet contributor to innovation, resilience, and the global reach of Allied air power. When the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was finally withdrawn from frontline service, its significance had already been secured through years of combat, adaptation, and global deployment. By 1944-1945, more advanced fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt in U.S. service, and the Spitfire, Tempest, and late-model Soviet Yaks and Lavochkins elsewhere, had surpassed the P-40 in speed, altitude performance, and versatility. Yet, even in its twilight years, the Warhawk remained in active use across multiple theaters, performing vital tasks until the end of the conflict. Its gradual retirement was therefore less a sudden replacement than a transition, as it continued to serve where conditions suited its strengths. In the Pacific, the P-40 lingered longest. Allied forces operating in secondary areas such as New Guinea, Burma, and the Solomon Islands continued to rely on it for air defense and ground attack well into 1944. Australian and New Zealand squadrons in particular used Kitty Hawks extensively in the island-hopping campaigns. There, its lower altitude combat envelope and durability remained valuable. Even as Mustangs began to arrive in the Pacific, P-40s kept flying in support of ground troops, strafing Japanese positions, and patrolling remote areas where the latest fighters were unavailable. On the Eastern Front, Soviet use of the Warhawk persisted into 1945. Though not as beloved as homegrown types, the P-40 still performed adequately at low and medium altitudes, escorting bombers, intercepting ground attack aircraft, and striking enemy positions. For Soviet pilots, its heavy armament and toughness made it preferable for certain missions, particularly where survivability outweighed raw performance. In many cases, Soviet P-40s continued to fly alongside newer Yak-9s and LA-7s until victory in Europe. As newer aircraft replaced it in US and British squadrons, many P-40s were transferred to Allied nations or relegated to training duties. In advanced pilot schools, the Warhawk became a stepping stone for airmen transitioning from basic trainers to high-performance combat aircraft. Its forgiving handling at low speeds, combined with the power of a liquid-cooled engine, made it a useful introduction to the characteristics of frontline fighters. Some squadrons even retained it as a fighter bomber for local defense or coastal patrol, freeing more advanced types for critical missions. The post-war years extended the Warhawk's life even further. Many surplus aircraft were delivered to smaller nations that lacked the resources to acquire the latest designs. Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, and several Latin American countries flew P-40s into the late 1940s, using them for air defense, patrol, and even limited combat in regional conflicts. In these roles, the Warhawk proved once again that ruggedness and reliability could often matter more than top performance. Its wide distribution through Lend-Lease and surplus programs gave it a second life, ensuring that Curtiss-built fighters remained visible in skies around the world long after the war had ended. Cultural memory of the Warhawk also secured its place in aviation history. The shark-mouthed nose art of the Flying Tigers became one of the most enduring images of the war, reproduced in posters, books, films, and even modern restorations. While other fighters gained fame for their technological achievements, the P-40 gained lasting recognition for its distinctive appearance and the stories of the men who flew it under desperate conditions. Its reputation as a tough workhorse resonated in post-war accounts, reminding future generations that winning wars often depended on dependable tools as much as on cutting-edge innovations. Today, the P-40 is preserved in museums and private collections across the globe. Restored Warhawks fly at air shows in the United States, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, their shark-mouth paint schemes immediately drawing attention. Historians emphasize that the P-40's legacy lies not in being the best fighter of its era, but in being the fighter that was available, adaptable, and widely used when it was most needed. It gave Allied pilots the means to fight back in 1940-1942 when no other modern American fighter was ready in such numbers, and it provided critical service across deserts, jungles, and frozen steppes. The Warhawk's conclusion as a frontline aircraft was therefore not an ending but a transformation. It moved from being the spearhead of early Allied air power to a global workhorse, trainer, and symbol of resilience. Its historical value lies precisely in this breadth of service. An aircraft that fought in every major theater, served in the air forces of more than 24 nations, and left behind an image as recognizable as any fighter of the Second World War. In this way, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk endures, not as the fastest or the most advanced, but as one of the most significant contributors to Allied air power in the era of total war. The full legacy of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk becomes clear only when placed in comparison with its contemporaries and in the context of the global air war. From a purely technical standpoint, the P-40 was never a world-beating design. It lacked the high-altitude performance of the Spitfire, the range of the Mustang, or the raw power of the Thunderbolt. Against the Japanese Zero, it could not match turning ability or climb. Yet despite these disadvantages, it played a decisive role during a period when availability and adaptability mattered more than perfection. The Warhawk was the aircraft that stood in the gap while other designs matured, ensuring that Allied pilots always had a capable fighter in the air during the most precarious years of the war. Its worldwide distribution meant that it became a familiar sight across multiple theaters, serving with distinction on 5 continents. In North Africa, it was the mainstay of the Desert Air Force before Spitfires and Mustangs arrived in strength. In the Pacific, it blunted Japanese offensives at a time when the Allies had few alternatives, proving that disciplined tactics could overcome technical inferiority. In China, its shark-mouthed nose became a rallying symbol, linking American, British, and Chinese efforts in a shared struggle. On the Eastern Front, though sometimes overlooked, it provided valuable support to the Soviet Union, demonstrating its versatility as both a fighter and a ground attack aircraft. The influence of the P-40 extended into production philosophy as well. Its design was pragmatic, an upgraded airframe with an available engine rather than a radical leap forward. This approach meant that it could be mass-produced quickly and exported widely, a quality essential in the early 1940s when Allied nations were desperately short of modern aircraft. More than 13,000 examples were built, making it one of the most produced American fighters of the war. While later designs surpassed it, the sheer scale of Warhawk production ensured that Allied air forces were never without a credible fighter presence during the crucial early campaigns. Doctrinally, the Warhawk reinforced the importance of tactics tailored to an aircraft's strengths. Pilots learned not to engage in turning battles with more agile opponents, but instead to exploit speed in dives, firepower in slashing passes, and resilience in ground attack missions. These lessons carried over to later aircraft and shaped Allied pilot training programs. The Warhawk thus acted as a proving ground for combat methods that emphasized energy fighting, coordinated teamwork, and disciplined engagement, all of which remained central to fighter doctrine through the rest of the war and beyond. The cultural legacy of the P-40 remains significant. More than any other American fighter of the early war, it captured the imagination through the Flying Tigers, whose shark-mouth paint scheme became one of the most iconic images of World War II aviation. This imagery carried on long after the war, appearing in films, literature, and popular culture, ensuring that the Warhawk was remembered not only as a machine, but as a symbol of defiance and resilience. While other fighters may have delivered greater victories, few inspired the same sense of identity among pilots and the public. Post-war, the aircraft continued to serve in smaller air forces, a testament to its durability and adaptability. For many nations, the P-40 represented their entry into the modern age of aviation, providing training and operational experience that laid the foundation for future air forces. Even in its obsolescence, it contributed to global aviation development by extending the reach of modern fighter doctrine to countries outside the major powers. In the end, the Warhawk's legacy is one of reliability, global reach, and symbolic power. It was not the fastest nor the most advanced, but it was available when urgently needed and proved itself again and again in conditions that would have overwhelmed less robust designs. It bridged the gap between the biplane era and the advanced fighters of the late war, carrying the burden of combat during the Allies' darkest hours. For that reason, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk remains one of the most important and enduring fighters of the Second World War, remembered as the workhorse that fought everywhere, with everyone, and gave the Allies time to build the air superiority that ultimately secured victory. The final chapter of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk's history is best understood not as a story of obsolescence, but as one of transition. By 1944-1945, the Warhawk was no longer the centerpiece of Allied air power. Faster, longer-ranged, and more versatile fighters such as the P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and late-model Spitfires had surpassed it in nearly every performance category. Yet the P-40 remained active across multiple fronts, continuing to deliver ground support, coastal patrols, and secondary fighter duties. Its ruggedness, ease of maintenance, and availability ensured it was never entirely sidelined, even in the closing months of the conflict. After the war, the aircraft's story entered a second phase, as surplus machines were distributed worldwide. Dozens of countries acquired Warhawks, either through lend-lease continuation or post-war transfers. Nations such as Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and Argentina operated the type into the late 1940s, often as their primary fighter in an era of tight budgets and limited access to newer technology. In Latin America, P-40s flew well into the early 1950s, serving in air defense, training, and even occasional combat roles during border skirmishes. This extended service life highlighted the Warhawk's reputation as a durable, reliable, and cost-effective platform long after its frontline career had ended in the major powers. For the United States, the P-40 faded quickly from operational inventories, replaced by advanced piston and jet fighters. Its role in American aviation history, however, was secure. It had carried U.S. forces through the desperate early months after Pearl Harbor, given the Army Air Forces their first real combat successes, and contributed to the gradual buildup of a global air arm that would dominate the skies by 1944. In this sense, it was a transitional machine, bridging the gap between interwar concepts and the high-performance designs that defined the later stages of the war. In museums and restorations, the P-40 achieved a different kind of immortality. Surviving examples, particularly those painted in the iconic shark-mouth livery of the Flying Tigers, became staples of air shows and historical displays. They stood as visual reminders of an era when Allied pilots fought at a disadvantage, yet prevailed through tactics, resilience, and determination. The Warhawk's silhouette, long nose, angular wings, and distinctive radiator intake remains instantly recognizable to aviation enthusiasts, symbolizing the hard-fought campaigns of North Africa, the Pacific Islands, and the skies over China. The aircraft's influence also carried forward into doctrine and design philosophy. It proved that a fighter did not need to be the fastest or the most technologically advanced to be effective in the right tactical context. Its emphasis on firepower, diving ability, and structural strength influenced the way air forces thought about fighter employment and pilot training. In many respects, it was a practical lesson in balancing technical performance with operational realities, an experience that shaped how later fighters were designed, procured, and deployed. Culturally, the P-40 holds a secure place in the collective memory of the Second World War. It was the machine of the Flying Tigers, the desert squadrons of North Africa, and the Commonwealth Air Forces in the Pacific. It represented the international character of the Allied war effort, flown by American, British, Soviet, Chinese, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and numerous other pilots. This wide distribution made it not only a weapon of war, but also a symbol of shared struggle across continents. In retrospect, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was not the best fighter of its era, but it was one of the most significant. It carried the burden of the early war when few other fighters were available, adapted to countless missions across diverse environments, and remained in service long after more advanced designs had appeared. Its story is one of practicality, resilience, and global reach. For this reason, the P-40 is remembered not as a footnote to the Spitfire or Mustang, but as a vital contributor in its own right, a fighter that held the line until the tide of war could turn, and in doing so secured its place as one of the enduring icons of World War II aviation.